My game is really one-dimensional, and this is how I fixed it. If you don't know what Blobs Dices is, it is a turn-based strategy game that was made for a 48-hour GMTK game jam, where a roll of the dice determines how many moves you will get, the damage of the moves, and what the enemies will do. My first idea was to incorporate Interactables. Interactables in levels are determined by the level itself, allowing the player to utilize these interactables to help themselves win. Interactables could be interacted by the player through clicking, damaging, or other factors. Right now, I have a few ideas on creating interactables. An idea is a Genie Lamp that would be present in the Sandy Beach section of the game. This Genie Lamp would deal damage to the nearest enemy, allowing players to escape from tricky situations and providing extra health. So I started by working on the functionality of the Genie Lamp. I wrote a quick script that can detect whenever the Genie Lamp was clicked and it triggers a function. But instead of using Unity's on mouse down function, I compared the mouse's world position to the Genie Lamp's position whenever the player clicked. I did this so that the other sprites could not cover the Genie Lamp and prevent the player from using it. I also made the Genie Lamp disappear when you clicked it by adding in this max uses field. I then attached another function onto the script that could manage the action of sending out a genie to damage the nearest enemy. All the function does is loop through all the enemies in the scene and locate the nearest object by comparing the distance between itself and the current enemy. It then deals a set amount of damage to the nearest enemy after a short delay. After I finished the functionality of the Genie Lamp, I decided to work on the visuals for it. The Genie Lamp itself would look like a stereotypical Genie Lamp, but I also needed to try out additional sand effects so that it looks buried when I put it in the sandy beach background. I opted to do something like the move Soul Strike. There is a light blue orb that goes slightly up and then lands on the selected enemy. But for the Genie Lamp, I'm going to add a slight smoky trail effect to the orb itself. I also animated the Genie Lamp slightly so that when you click it, it does this little animation. I also added these little puff effects to make the effect look even better. This is what it looks like now. Another interactable that I thought of was a frozen mirror. The frozen mirror would be used in the frosted tundras. The frozen mirror applies and amplifies any status effects that it has to all other enemies. It doesn't matter if it's a positive or a negative effect, all enemies will receive it. I started out by planning out how it was going to be triggered. I decided that the game should treat it as an enemy. This would allow the mirror to be triggered by enemies, resulting in more difficulty for the player if they did not utilize the mirror beforehand. The mirror could appear throughout the waves of enemies as it can be triggered by them, but this would come at the cost of the player needing to sacrifice the mirror at the end of the wave. This is because if the next wave uses all the enemy spots, then the last enemy would not have any spots to occupy because the mirror is using the first spot. I also wouldn't want the player to collect a bunch of mirrors since mirrored effects would apply to other mirrors, causing a big issue. But I also had something to keep in mind whenever I used the mirror. I didn't want the player to see the mirror moving around when they defeated blobs, since normal blobs would take the places of defeated enemies. So I made sure that I would have the mirror be first in the enemy array list so that it would not have to move, though moves like Tempest Tornado could in theory move the mirror. The mirror would also have a low amount of HP, which disincentivizes the player from using splash moves since it would break the frozen mirror. I wanted to make the frozen mirror look like a crystal mirror that would pop up from the ground, so I began working on the drawing. After finishing the drawing, I then split the frozen mirror into individual pieces so I could animate it in the editor. I also found some shine particles to give the mirror a bit more life. Then I drew some god rays to give the mirror a bit more impact when it applies the status effects to the enemies. For animations, I made a quick build-up animation for when the crystal appears, which looks like this, and I made a destruction animation for when the mirror is used. Here is what the mirror looks like in action. Another problem I wanted to resolve was the issue that the game was way too repetitive. Each level would just be enter, kill, and exit. There would be no variety. So I created conditions or missions. Conditions are requirements that you would have to complete in order to beat a level. It allows for much more variety in level design, as I would design levels around using a certain condition. An example would be the pre-picked moves condition. This condition is rather self-explanatory. Instead of being given full freedom over what moves you want to wanted to use, the level would instead pre-pick some of them. The level would then be balanced around these pre-picked moves, making it a sort of puzzle that the player has to solve, albeit with a bit of randomness from the dice. Another example would be an escort mission. This escort mission would require you to keep one or multiple enemies alive all the way from the beginning to the end. Again, levels would be balanced around this gimmick in order to create engaging levels. The introductory level to this mechanic forces you to escort a sandcastle blob to the end, forcing you to put up with the stunning mechanic of this blob, so you have to plan ahead whenever you see the roll of 6 pop up. These are the more interesting objectives, but there are some other objectives that are not meant to change the way you play the game. They are meant to assist in introducing an enemy or as a quick challenge for you to accomplish. Some of these objectives would include stat requirements, such as dealing a minimum amount of damage, healing a maximum amount of health, applying a certain status effect to multiple enemies, conserving the amount of energy you can use, and more. Some of them can still be used to create interesting levels, such as the maximum amount of dealt damage. You have to actively look out for enemies that are about to use a healing move and either stun them or quickly dispatch of them before they can cause problems. There are still other condition ideas I have, but I'll keep them for another video. The last thing I did to make the game less one-dimensional was to add tiles to levels. Tiles would act as a positional modifier to a level, so an enemy standing on a necromancy tile would be revived. To allow the player to counter this mechanic, tiles would only affect the position they are placed on. So to avoid reviving an enemy on a necromancy tile, you would either defeat an enemy one index in front of the necromanced enemy so that the necromanced enemy moves forward in the next turn, or you could use a move like Tempest Tornado to move the enemy away from the necromancy tile. So far, I only have one idea for a tile, which belongs in Sandy Beach. But before I can tell you what this tile does, I need to explain a gimmick mainly used in Sandy Beach. There are these plant blobs, and there are blobs that can apply the status effect of wet to the player. Whenever these plant blobs deal damage to a wet player, they gain a buff. The buff could be a small health buff or some passive healing. However, if a plant blob damages a wet player, the wet status effect is removed, since you are kind of watering the plant blobs. This makes it important to look out for the attack orders of the enemies in a certain level in order to see if a plant blob will receive a buff. Puddle tiles will be present throughout Sandy Beach. They actually have a lifespan of 3 turns, as they are created by a tidal wave ambush. Do you think you can guess what these puddle tiles do? Well, they trigger the buff effect for a plant blob each turn, so you have to make sure that a plant blob is not standing on a puddle, otherwise you'll have a bad time dealing with them. Well, this sums up what I've achieved in these last 2 weeks. I'm going to try upload videos every 2 or 3 weeks if I have time, but anyways, if you have enjoyed the video, you can subscribe and watch other devlogs about this indie game. Bye!